Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. It's Meathead Monday, where I re-record a script from a video from before my meaty head was on camera, but this time with my meaty head on camera. Today, we're responding to Deflate's video called Why It's 98% Certain That There Is No Tree of Life. And I'm just going to go out on a limb of the Tree of Life here, and guess that he's going to take quotes about how a tree isn't a great analogy, it's probably more like a web or a bush, out of context, and then end with a checkmate Darwinus, as though fixing an analogy to match up more closely with the thing it's supposed to be analogizing is a bad thing. Let's go!
Darwin's Tree of Life is most likely not a description of how life on Earth emerged and diversified. I know that's a shocker.
Yeah, it's totally shocking that after a century and a half of research into a scientific field, we no longer hold to exactly what the first guy to ever write a book about it said, like it was the word of God or something. Though, now that I've said that, I think I might have a clue as to why creationists keep attacking Darwin as though any attack on a scientist from the 19th century somehow invalidates the work of scientists in the 21st century. And yes, I know Darwin wasn't the first person to write anything that led to the development of the theory of evolution. That's called hyperbole, and it happens sometimes, so deal with it.
And yet some scientists go as far as to say that the Tree of Life has actually been annihilated by an onslaught of negative evidence. Join me for this video to find out why one of the most popular arguments for Darwinian evolution may actually be a non-starter.
This is reinforcing my suspicions about where this video is going. Spoiler, evolution is more complicated than Darwin thought it was. Darwin died nearly 40 years before the significance of DNA was really starting to be appreciated, and the molecule of DNA wasn't itself discovered until 10 years after Origin of Species was published. And that's a story where a scientist had his doctor friend send him used pus-filled bandages for his research, so that's fun. But the main takeaway here is that proving Darwin wrong about something is not the same as proving evolution wrong. Now, I'm skipping his recap. He says a lot that's wrong, but that has already been covered extensively, and I'll make sure to link to the playlist.
Given that no attempt to reconcile paleontology with evolutionary theory has succeeded, Darwinian evolutionists have come to admit that the fossil record doesn't fit with their theory, as we will see at the end of this video.
Again, spoiler alert, but at this point I have watched ahead, and no, nobody says that. Except creationists. We'll get to it.
For the same reason, they've started to turn their focus towards another field of study in their search for support of evolution: homology and phylogenetic trees.
Now, pay attention to the phrasing he's using here. He is painting a picture of researchers looking into the fossil record for evidence for evolution, coming up blank, and then turning to homology as the backup for when the fossil record fails. The problem is, that's not even close to how it happened. As he will himself point out later in this video, right from the very beginning of the modern formulation of the theory of evolution, that is, Darwin's book, both fossils and homology are used as evidence. He just won't put them close enough together to make it obvious that his portrayal of homology as being a backup for when fossils fail is a mischaracterization. I'm skipping ahead a bit farther now as he goes over what homology is, and true to his pattern, he demonstrates a decent understanding of the basics. Just as a refresher, features are said to be homologous when they share similarities that have their basis in evolutionary history. That is, features that just look similar and perform similar functions are not necessarily homologous, they are only homologous if they are similar due to sharing a common ancestor. And the similarity need not be functional, as evolution does often repurpose existing structures for different functions. So the skeletal structure of the vertebrates is homologous because it first developed in the early vertebrate lineage, and all vertebrates since then have had variations on the same general layout. But if we get a bit more specific, the tetrapod body plan is a more obvious example of homology, most notably the forelimbs. All tetrapods have the same layout of bones in their forelimbs, importantly, in the same order. Often creationists will claim that we just find things that look vaguely similar, give them the same name, and then use the fact that they are named the same thing to declare them homologous and therefore evidence for evolution. But the bones in the tetrapod forelimbs seem to be constrained to a very specific pattern. From the shoulder we get one single bone, the humerus, connected to two bones, the radius and ulna, which then connects to a group of wrist bones, the carpals, which then split off into the metacarpals, which are the beginnings of the digits, and then at the end, the phalanges, which are the finger bones. This pattern is the same across all tetrapods. It doesn't need to be. There are other arrangements that could work better for the things that the various species use these bones for, but it is, which is highly indicative of a shared common ancestor. But then we also find things that share a purpose or function but do not appear to share a common ancestor. Those are analogous traits. This kinda eliminates the creationist argument that we just claim things to be homologous because they're named the same. Because things like the tympanic membrane in mammals are not homologous to the tympanic membrane in birds and reptiles, despite having the same name and the same function. The ability to detect sound seems to have evolved independently both in the reptile-bird lineage and in the mammal lineage.
It all starts with chapter 13 in Darwin's On the Origin of Species, which bears the title The Mutual Affinities of Organic Beings.
Now, this is in the segment that I am in the process of skipping, but I just wanted you guys to see that he is perfectly aware of the fact that Darwin was using homology in the formulation of his theory right from the beginning. So keep that in mind when he phrases things to imply that homology is a backup for when the fossil record fails.
Darwin's original argument from homology was concerned with anatomical structures as one could see them with the naked eye. However, the rise of biochemistry in the 20th century has opened up the possibility of investigating homology not only on the anatomical, but also on the genetic or molecular level.
And here, it is important to distinguish between morphological homology and sequence homology. The thing is, it is possible to construct an evolutionary phylogeny for every single one of the genes in a given genome. Hypothetically possible, at least. It takes a lot of data from several different species and individual members of each species to do it accurately, so it's not necessarily practical at this time. But somewhat counterintuitively, not all the genes of a single organism will share a phylogeny, and that phylogeny will not necessarily match up with the overall morphological phylogeny for that organism. Because while morphology is determined mostly by genetics, there are many genes that do not have an impact on morphology, and so they can change quite a bit without showing a corresponding outward change. And when constructing phylogenies, it is helpful to keep in mind that genes are not forced to change when we humans arbitrarily decide that something is now a different species. So it is possible to have genes that are still identical between different species, such as the several copies of the nanog gene that can be found in chimps and humans, while having different genes that are evolving within a single species, like the gene in humans that gives us lactose tolerance into adulthood. For more detail on this subject, take a look at my Evidence for Evolution series, particularly the videos on homology, phylogeny, and sequence homology.
The idea is basically this. Just as similar anatomical structures in different animals point to common ancestry and descent with modification, the same can be said of similar molecular structures in different animals.
Yes, with the caveat that similarity is not the only criterion by which we determine if a structure or sequence is homologous.
You've probably heard people say that evolution must be true because we share 99% of our DNA with chimpanzees.
Yes, you probably have. The percentage similarity is a bit of a tricky number to calculate, though. It's not as simple a comparison as you might think. But yes, the comparison of the chimp genome and the human genome does show us to be very closely related. And there's more to it than just a percentage similarity. For instance, the nanog gene that I mentioned earlier. The working nanog gene regulates embryonic stem cell pluripotency. That is, it makes sure the embryonic stem cells can change into whatever they need to change into for as long as is necessary for development. But both chimps and humans have a number of nanog pseudogenes, instances of this gene that were duplicated throughout the genome but are no longer functional. The functional gene is located on the same spot of the genome for chimps and humans, in chromosome 12. Humans then have 11 broken copies of the gene spread out throughout the rest of the genome, while chimps have 10. And all of the copies of the nanog gene, except for the one on chromosome 15, are in identical locations on the genome, with chimps not having any nanog pseudogenes on chromosome 15. What this means is that our common ancestor with chimps already had the 10 broken copies in those locations, and then after we diverged from chimps, an 11th copy was duplicated into chromosome 15.
It's important to know that Darwinian scientists don't just point to the similarity between forelimbs, legs, or this and that gene, and then say, ha, evolution in a random case-by-case kind of fashion.
Credit where it's due. That is exactly the picture that most creationists paint of the evidence from homology. Kent Hovind is particularly egregious for this. And just as a tangent, in the video from a few years ago where Hovind whacked me, he opened by listing a bunch of atheists who he had whacked before and hadn't made another evolution-themed video since their whacking, suggesting that he successfully debunked those people to the point where they could no longer promote evolution.
Simon Dan hasn't done any more on evolution since we whacked him back down about 4 times. Very good, Simon, wise man. Rachel hasn't done any more, and Seth, I haven't seen yours yet. I have to go back and look, but you guys are learning.
Well, I have continued making videos about evolution since being whacked. In fact, my Evidence for Evolution series premiered a mere 5 days after he whacked me. And yet, Kent hasn't had the guts to whack me a second time. At least, not that I'm aware of. I don't really follow him closely and rely on other people to point out when he mentions me, so it's possible that he has and I missed it, but I don't think so. Guess my content is just too good for him to find any flaws in, so he's scared to even address it.
While this may capture how homology is understood and utilized in discussions by the average person, evolutionary biologists have a more complex understanding of homology. According to them, studying homology is nothing less than the key to mapping out the entire tree of life.
Not sure where you got that idea from. I mean, yeah, the entire tree of life for all organisms would be nice to have, but that's kind of an unattainable goal. Really, the study of homology is limited to constructing a phylogeny for whatever feature, function, gene, or structure is being looked at the time. So no, homology is not nothing less than the key to mapping out the entire tree of life. It's a piece of the puzzle, and a fairly chunky piece at that, but it is not the only method we have for constructing phylogenies, and I don't think any scientist would tell you that we have a chance of seeing a complete and accurate tree of life anytime soon. Though certainly there are efforts being made to accurately categorize all the organisms that we know about today, but given the rarity of the fossilization process, we likely only know of a fraction of a percentage of all of the organisms that ever existed, so there will always be gaps.
Evolutionary biologists who study what is called systematics and phylogeny are engrossed in efforts to reconstruct the tree of life.
Well, as much as possible, but I'd imagine that most of the work isn't at such a large scale. Usually researchers are looking to construct a phylogeny for one thing at a time.
We'll be talking about this a lot from now on, but before we do, there is something that's absolutely crucial to be aware of for our discussion. Something which can easily go forgotten, and it's this. Evolution is not just an abstract idea or a concept. No, if evolution is true, if there was one or a few ancestor animals from which all other animals have evolved, then this means that there was one specific way in which this actually happened historically.
Yes, this is true, and this will remain true despite what he says about it a bit later.
This is perfectly captured by Richard Dawkins, who says that there is, after all, one true tree of life, the unique pattern of evolutionary branchings that actually happened. What Dawkins means, and rightly so, is that evolution is not just a theoretical concept and that it doesn't really matter how it played out in history.
Yep. And it is important to keep in mind that there is a difference between how it actually happened and how it potentially happened. As creationists are so fond of pointing out, we cannot go back in time and directly watch it happen. We have to put the puzzle together based on the evidence collected in the present. And given just the sheer number of species that exist and have existed, all evolving in different directions at the same time, whatever phylogeny we end up constructing will almost certainly not be perfectly accurate to what actually happened.
No, evolution must have unfolded in one specific way, and accordingly, the tree of life has one specific shape, with each branch and node of that tree occupied by a specific organism.
And in most cases, we will never be able to determine for sure which specific organisms will exist at which specific nodes. In order to get that specific, we'd have to get down to the level of placing each individual on the tree of life, because there are slight changes between every generation, and even if a species could be said to be the ancestor of another species, the traits develop individually sometimes. So, as an example, the mutation that eventually led to a cetacean's blowhole being on the top of its head rather than on the tip of its snout might have happened in the same species as the one that had the mutation that led to their forelimbs becoming flippers, but in a different individual. And as usual, this is massively oversimplifying it. There is no way that either of those macro trait developments were the result of one single mutation each. They would have been happening slowly, as evolution does.
That's why the aim of evolutionary biology is to take the idea of evolution and show how it actually played out in real life, or to reconstruct the course evolution actually took in history, and to show where specific organisms sit on the nodes and branches of the tree of life.
Not really. I've never seen a phylogeny mapped out with actual species listed on the nodes themselves, because barring some pretty fantastic scientific advances, it will never be possible to know for sure which species existed there, so we will always assume that we don't have the full picture when mapping phylogenies.
In principle, the Darwinian argument from homology, coupled with the aspiration to draw up the tree of life, does make sense, and here is why.
Because homology is evidence for evolution and can be mapped out on phylogenies. It's really quite simple. Well, not really, there's more to it than that, but essentially something is not labeled homologous until its phylogeny has been mapped out far enough to determine that whatever similarities we're looking at actually are due to common ancestry rather than independent evolution. So we could quibble about whether homology counts as evidence for evolution in and of itself, but it's easier when summarizing to just skip all that and say homology is evidence for evolution. But I know creationists love to ignore the bit about something not being called homologous until there's a bunch of evidence that that thing evolved, and instead focus on the definition of homology containing the assumption of evolution, so these clarifications become necessary.
If it is true that all organisms are ultimately related to each other due to their descent from a common ancestor, then the more genetic and anatomical cross-examinations you run between them, the clearer a picture you get of how all these organisms are related to each other. Each comparison should help you crystallize the tree of life, so to speak.
Yes, but with a big ol' but. The but being that this depends on what we're looking at. As I mentioned earlier, genetically speaking, it can get messy in a hurry, because not all genes evolve at the same rate. So when mapping out phylogenies, the genetic phylogenies will not necessarily match up with a more broad species phylogeny that is made using mostly morphology. And genetic phylogenies will be different for different genes in the same organism. Hell, within your own body, you have crystalline proteins that are homologous to other crystalline proteins that are also in your own body, meaning that they diverged and evolved all by themselves without having enough of an impact to result in large morphological changes. And this is why some scientists have advocated against using the tree as an analogy for evolution. Depending on what aspect of evolution we're looking at, it gets way more complicated than the tree analogy is capable of communicating.
Also, and this is absolutely key, if all organisms are related to one another, then all your comparative studies of homology, no matter whether they're rooted in anatomy or genetics, should end up cohering with one another, because they would all uncover parts of one and the same big picture.
Yes, but one of the things that it's important to understand about phylogenetics is that it is largely an exercise in statistics. To simplify, modern phylogenetics makes great use of computer modeling. They will have a computer run thousands of simulated evolutionary phylogenies and figure out which ones are statistically most likely to happen in the real world. But in the real world, there are thousands, if not millions, of potential evolutionary paths, per gene, per feature, per whatever else you care to look at. So when examining different genes, features, structures, or whatever, you will sometimes find that different and conflicting trees end up being the most likely outcome. This is because, in the real world, the most likely outcome is not always the path that evolution will take. Sometimes it will take a less likely outcome, because that's how statistics work. If you flip a coin 4 times in a row, there's about a 40% chance that you'll end up with 2 heads and 2 tails, which means that there's a 60% chance for any other outcome. So when actually flipping coins, we would expect that 4 flips would not yield an exact 50-50 proportion of heads and tails, and if modeling a history of coin flips, the result would be that the non-50-50 path is the path that was taken in reality. But since the 50-50 path is not actually impossible, the result from the model might not match up perfectly with the reality of the situation. It's the same with evolution, except the likelihood of one evolutionary path over another could be different by mere fractions of a percent, and so it becomes much easier for nature to take the slightly less likely path.
Again, as Dawkins said, there is after all one true tree of life. Of course, this is not to say that mapping out the tree of life is supposed to be easy, that all comparisons should immediately fit hand in glove with each other, and that it should never be the case that evolutionary biologists will have to make adjustments as they aspire to reconstruct the tree of life. However, it is to say the following: if evolution is true and if all animals go back to one common ancestor, there should emerge from systematics at least an overall tendency towards a unified picture of how evolutionary history played out.
And on a macro scale, that's exactly what we see.
Ever since gene sequences began to be used to construct the tree of life, evolutionary biologists have run a wide range of studies in both genetic and anatomical homologies, comparing various genes, proteins, RNA molecules, and anatomical features between different animals.
And as pointed out, sometimes within the same animal. Because all of those things will be evolving at different rates, and so all of those things will have their own phylogeny, and these phylogenies, while different, are not mutually exclusive.
However, the results of these studies have not converged. Instead, each study ends up with its own tree of life, its own picture of how evolutionary history must have played out, depending on the genes, anatomical features, and animals that are being compared.
You seem to be carefully using the phrase must have played out to indicate that the results from whatever study are being presented as though that is the one definitive tree of life as it happened in reality, as opposed to that phylogeny being a hypothetical tree, sometimes for a very specific feature. Like, just think of the development of lactose tolerance. That was a mutation that happened about 10,000 years ago. So if we construct a phylogenetic tree for the gene involved there, we will see this mutation event showing up 10,000 years ago, and we can track the same gene in non-mutated populations in order to build a whole phylogeny, figuring out when certain changes took place on the tree. But that doesn't match up with our anatomical phylogeny, as you put it. We didn't have a speciation event 10,000 years ago with two diverging human species, one able to digest milk as adults and the other not, because the genes don't evolve at the same rate as the species as a whole.
In other words, we don't get one big coherent picture, but several pictures which mutually contradict each other.
They only mutually contradict if you don't understand how they work.
For example, biologist Michael Sivanen compared no less than 2,000 genes in 6 animals from various phyla. Clearly, given the breadth and depth of his project, one would have expected that this one study would have also yielded one account of evolutionary history, one tree of life.
Before he gets into it, I would just like to remind everyone that phylogenetics is heavily rooted in statistics. Many competing trees, with researchers trying to figure out which are the most probable.
However, here is what the New Scientist reported. In theory, he, Sivanen, should have been able to use the gene sequences to construct an evolutionary tree showing the relationships between the 6 animals. He failed. The problem was that different genes told contradictory evolutionary stories.
Yes, but you're leaving out some key information here. The 6 types of animals were humans, frogs, sea squirts, sea urchins, fruit flies, and nematodes. The ones that created problems were the sea squirts. About half of the genes they looked at for sea squirts had a phylogeny that would place them in the Chordata phylum, and the other half put them in the Echinodermata phylum with sea urchins. How can this be? Well, if we look at the work that Sivanen is known for, it's the idea that horizontal gene transfer is an active evolutionary force not just for single-celled organisms, but also for larger organisms, an hypothesis that could account for sea squirts being essentially half chordate and half Echinodermata, without breaking evolution. In horizontal gene transfer, one species would absorb genetic material from a different species, giving rise to a genetic lineage that, should you map it out, would appear to jump around a more traditional phylogenetic tree. Because that's exactly what it did. So you did the typical creationist thing where you explain the problem, but then stop reading before the article gets to the solution to the problem.
Not only did Sivanen himself have no problem admitting his failure,
he wasn't admitting his failure, because he was setting out to demonstrate that horizontal gene transfer is more important than most researchers normally think, and that's what he did. So he had no problem admitting to his success after several decades of work in that field. Remember, the "he failed" part of your quote was someone else talking about Sivanen. It wasn't Sivanen himself. The article you are quoting is not a research paper, it's a popular magazine article that is trying to be interesting. That was part of the tension building, making it look like Sivanen was trying to build a tree of life, and then upon failing, realize that it's not a tree, it's a web because of horizontal gene transfer. Except Sivanen's life's work seems to be dedicated to that very concept. So, if anything, this is just a weird way to say that the failure to create a coherent phylogeny in these genes that show evidence of being the result of horizontal gene transfer is evidence that horizontal gene transfer is important to the evolutionary development of macroorganisms to a greater degree than was previously thought.
But he also moved on to challenge the Darwinian paradigm itself by saying that we've just annihilated the tree of life. It's not a tree anymore, it's a different topology entirely. What would Darwin have made of that?
See, again, you're missing context. He's talking about how it's more of a web with horizontal gene transfer acting to move genes between species in ways that wouldn't be adequately represented by a tree. To quote W. Doolittle from earlier in that article, "The tree of life is not something that exists in nature, it's a way that humans classify nature. Nature has this nasty little habit of not fitting properly into the categories that humans like to build for it, and usually, this failure to fit into our classification system is a direct result of evolution happening. Discrete categories are what we would expect from design, but with evolution happening gradually over time, we would expect the lines to be blurry, and sometimes to not go in the direction that we'd normally expect if horizontal gene transfer is at play."
Now, Sivanan's study is not the exception. The New Scientist pointed out that many biologists now argue that the tree concept is obsolete and needs to be discarded. The evolution of animals and plants isn't exactly tree-like. Accordingly, the magazine went on to describe the Darwinian project of mapping out the tree of life as lying in tatters, torn to pieces by an onslaught of negative evidence.
It really is amazing how thoroughly you seem to have read this article, all while missing the entire point. Seriously, to get that Sivanan quote, you actually had to go past the end of the article down to the post-article related mini-article section that they have. And now you're jumping all over it, finding all the instances where it says that the tree isn't quite how nature actually is, and instead of figuring out why they are saying that, you just assume that this means we can discard the idea of phylogenies altogether.
Other magazines have offered the same conclusion. Trends in Ecology and Evolution has pointed out that evolutionary trees from different genes often have conflicting branching patterns.
Hey, Lucas? Pro tip here, but when you make changes to a text that you are quoting with quotation marks around it, you're supposed to indicate those changes by putting them in square brackets. The word evolutionary is not supposed to be capitalized, as it is not the first word of the sentence, and the period is actually a comma as the sentence continues for a bit after that. So, let's read the whole sentence, shall we? Quote, "With the increasing abundance of molecular data and the recognition that evolutionary trees from different genes often have conflicting branching patterns, it is becoming increasingly feasible to implement multi-locus approaches to phylogenetic inference." Do you know what multi-locus approaches means? Well, without getting into the weeds of genetic loci, suffice it to say for now that it accounts for instances where a single gene may have an evolutionary origin that is spread out over multiple other genes. In other words, this research explains why a tree is inadequate to be a visual representation of evolution at the genetic level.
And the Biological Reviews has acknowledged that phylogenetic conflict is common and frequently the norm rather than the exception.
And in the case of this paper, they were advocating for a multifaceted approach to phylogeny. Rather than relying exclusively on morphology or molecular phylogenies, the methods should be combined in order to minimize potential biases in the data. The phrase multi-locus approach makes a return in this paper, unsurprisingly, and of course, as is often the case in creationist material, you're quoting the part of the study that was explaining the problem that they are attempting to solve, and ignoring everything that comes after the explanation of the problem, as though they didn't go on to provide potential solutions backed up by piles of data.
Antonis Rokas, who is considered a leading figure in genetic homology, concluded that despite the amount of data and breadth of taxa analyzed, relationships among most phyla remain unresolved. He went on to state that the complete and accurate tree of life remains an elusive goal.
I was going to skip this one for time, but it ended up being the most egregious example of context removal thus far. There are 2 ellipses in this quote indicating missing sections. Normally, this is done to shorten a verbose quote and make it more pithy while attempting to preserve the original meaning. But in this case, the first ellipsis is replacing one single word, metazoan. Metazoan is basically the classification that all animals fall under, so this quote is saying that the relationships between the animal phyla are largely unresolved. Then there's another ellipsis, but in this case, it's not skipping a word or two of a single quote. It's jumping straight out of this paper to quote the same researcher's words from an article he wrote for the Broad Institute, a group founded by MIT and Harvard that is dedicated to researching genomic medicine. But setting that aside for now, let's read the sentence in the paper that comes immediately after the quoted sentence. Quote, "In contrast, the same genes robustly resolve phylogenetic relationships within a major clade of fungi of approximately the same age as the metazoa." In other words, the tree of life works no problem for other clades, and this paper sets out to figure out why it doesn't work for metazoans, which it briefly summarizes in the abstract as well. Quote, "The differences in resolution within the 2 kingdoms suggest that the early history of metazoans was a radiation compressed in time, a finding that is in agreement with paleontological inferences. The metazoan tree has less resolution than the fungal tree because it underwent a closely spaced series of cladogenic events. That is, early in its evolutionary history, the animal lineage evolved very rapidly, which makes the evolutionary relationships hard to map out today." Back to the article written for the Broad Institute, he essentially goes over the problem that I've already laid out, in that genes do not necessarily share the same phylogeny as the organism they belong to, and individual genes within one organism could potentially have different phylogenies.
So far, we've only looked at the picture of the tree of life that emerges from studies that are gene-based.
Blah blah blah, now let's quote mine some studies that are based on morphology, yada yada, skip! Well, it's actually slightly different. In this one, rather than point out inconsistencies with morphological phylogenies, he's pointing out inconsistencies between the morphological ones and the sequence-based ones. But the quote mining aspect is the same. He takes quote mines from the introductions and abstracts of papers and articles that point out a problem, and then he ignores the solutions presented in those same papers and articles. After doing the ones that compare molecular phylogenies to morphological phylogenies, he moves on to purely morphological comparisons and does more of the same quote mining.
So, systematics, no matter whether they're concerned with genetics, morphology, or both, consistently yield mutually contradictory trees of life, which is why it's been said that in point of fact there exists no such thing as the traditional textbook phylogeny. A diversity of different schemes can be found.
In context, this is pointing out that the phylogenies that are being presented in textbooks tend to vary depending on what data the textbook authors are looking at. Like, it's literally talking about textbooks, not using the word textbook to mean a perfect example. And it basically comes back to what I explained earlier about phylogenetics being a statistical endeavor.
I said at the beginning that Darwinists have resorted to studies of genetic or molecular homology, partly because they realized that the fossil record did not confirm evolutionary theory.
Right, you did say that. Right before bringing up Darwin's chapter in his inaugural book on evolution that dealt with homology, and before leaving out parts of quotes that point out how the findings are in agreement with paleontology, thereby demonstrating your own spin of the situation to be completely inaccurate.
For example, evolutionary biologist Jerry Coyne says that now we have a powerful new and independent way to establish ancestry. We can look directly at the genes themselves by sequencing the DNA of various species and measuring how similar these sequences are. We can reconstruct their evolutionary relationships. Essentially, what he means by independent is independent of the fossil record.
I mean, not just the fossil record, also independent of things like comparative embryology or the study of modern morphology, but the fossil record is included in that. Having independent fields of research is not the same as resorting to a new explanation after an old one has failed.
Which has challenged evolutionary theory due to its lack of transitional forms.
Not getting into that here, go watch the rest of the playlist if you're interested. And at this point I realize that this video is probably in the middle of a series, so I should probably do the rest of the series next.
Richard Dawkins takes an even more outspoken stance as he bluntly states that we don't need fossils. The case for evolution is watertight without them.
Saying we don't need fossils is not the same as saying the fossil record doesn't support evolution, so we're going to switch to using homology instead. It is saying that even if we didn't have the fossil record, which itself is excellent evidence for evolution, we would still have other excellent evidence for evolution.
Now, these statements have a rather strange aftertaste as they basically communicate that molecular evidence is more important than evidence from the fossil record. In other words, they imply that the work of molecular biologists is more valid than the work of paleontologists.
Nope, not even close. And it's quite telling that you couldn't find a quote to mine that gets that point across for you, even using the dishonest quote-altering tactics that you've put on display thus far. I mean, with how loose you play it with the ellipses, I'm pretty sure that you could just put one after every word and say that pretty much any prominent promoter of evolution has once said, quote, evolution, ellipsis, is, ellipsis, not, ellipsis, true. That'd be just as powerful as any evidence that you've provided in this video. That is to say, not powerful at all unless you are willing to ignore what comes in between those words. After that, he essentially goes into summary mode, while pretending that evolutionary biologists will grudgingly accept the findings of paleontology when figuring out the timings of certain evolutionary events, which is just laughable, but I'll leave it here. Today's comment of the day comes to us from The Inverse Way, who says, "The true hoax revealed, Flat Earth was sparked by Nikon to sell their P900. Honestly, that wouldn't surprise me all that much, as the P900 was a very gimmicky camera that serious photographers tend to avoid. But that said, Nikon has actually been one of the primary suppliers of EVA-capable cameras for NASA since the 1970s, so every time a flat earther buys a P900, or I guess P1000 now, they're supporting the company that made cameras that took a lot of the pictures that they claim are fake propaganda CGI nonsense. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the ellipses that replace the context that is my channel. If you'd like creationists to use you indiscriminately, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my wishlist on Throne. Links to social media, all the ways to support the channel, and to my other projects can be found at links.vicerhino.com. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my PO box address is in the description. See you next time!